Bhante, let's begin with the obvious in a way. It's not that usual to see a monk championing Bhikkhunis and the Buddhist women's cause, for which we are very grateful. But how did that interest come about?
It's crazy, right? I mean, I don't know why this is kind of something that's so unusual. Yeah, I don't know if it's that unusual, but anyway, it's a bit, I don't know why it's not normal. How did it come about? Well, as always with Buddhism, there's a kind of endless chain of causality, isn't there? So one, depending on how far you want to trace it back in the past, I could point back to the time when I was playing rock and roll and we employed two women as our roadies. And Lisa and Thisbe were bringing in the big heavy boxes of speakers and all of this kind of stuff. And we were the only band that I knew that had women roadies. And so I don't know, for me, it was never a kind of thing, you know. And like I think so many women find when they go into monasteries that they suddenly get kind of cornered by gender and you're just kind of waltzing freely through the world and things are fine. And you walk into a monastery and somebody says, here's a box, we're going to call it gender and you belong there. And, you know, that kind of happens when you're a monk as well. But of course, well, when you're a man, but then of course you tend to get put in the nice box. So that's okay, you know, and you don't really think about it too much. But like when I was at, you know, my first experiences at, as a monk were in Thailand. And so one of the things that really kind of struck me is that a lot of people have opinions about Asian Buddhism or traditional Buddhism that lead the complexity of the reality that's being lived by the people in those places. For example, the first monastery I was at, Wat Rampung, you know, it's just a fairly straightforward Thai monastery, but they had a lot of meditation retreats. And the mei-chis, the white-robed nuns, used to cook the food. One of the nuns was getting really into her meditation, and she said to one of the other nuns, you know, I want to meditate. You know, can I just get out of doing kitchen duties for a week or something like that and do some meditation? And the other nun said, no, you can't. It's our duty. And she went to the monk who was teaching it, and the monk said, yeah, sure, if you want to meditate, go for it. And so, you know, the dynamic around these things is more complex and more nuanced than we might think. When I was in Wat Nanachat, so I was ordained at Wat Nanachat, which is the primary monastery for ordaining Western or English-speaking monastics in Thailand, or was at that time. Then, you know, one of the first things that you realize was there was a lady who used to one of the Upasakas there, long-term resident. Her name was Heidi. She was a Kiwi. And, you know, when we arrived as men, we would arrive, we'd stay in the monastery, we'd work in the kitchen, help out and all of these kinds of things. And we would become really good friends with Heidi. She was terrific. She was very funny. She was very smart. She knew a lot. And, you know, generations of monks, I don't know about generations, but many years of monks became good friends with her as we went through there and ordained. And then you find sort of one day, you know, I'm putting on the brown robes and sitting on a high seat and Heidi's coming and bowing to me. And everything's awkward and weird now. And she can never do that. And, you know, you start to sort of realize that there's something about this whole kind of way that the system's put together that is just not really right. And I remember when Heidi went then to one of the senior monks, and this was on his account, not from her account, to the senior monks to talk about some issue that some of the women had or something like that. And he said to her, this is a boys' club, and if I was you, I wouldn't be here. So that certainly had the virtue of honesty.
I was reading one of your articles, Bhante, and you said that one of your first observations when you began on the sort of Dharma path was how many women came to the teachings, how many women came to centres, and yet how few went on to ordain. So it's really two questions. Why do we see so many women actually wanting to hear the teachings?
and
the problems of ordination?
Well, again, I asked this when I was a young monk in Thailand, and so I sort of see, it was like 80% women coming to the monastery. So I asked one of the men there, I said, why is it that mostly women come to the monastery? He said, because the men are working hard. Women don't have anything to do all day. And I was looking at the women like working in the kitchen and working on the fields and doing all of the things they're doing. And I'm thinking, is that right? So I asked one of the women, I said, why is it that there's so many women coming and no few men? She said, because all the men like going to the brothels. Instead of the monastery. I was like, oh yeah, that tracks, yeah.
And looking at this sort of problem generally, to what extent is the treatment of women, of nuns, reflecting the treatment of women generally in society, which, in recent years has all come to the fore with the Me Too movement? And yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, it is a reflection, and the roles of women within spiritual communities do reflect society, but they don't reflect society in a kind of an exact way. And I think that there's like, how do I put this? There's a kind of underlying tension in the way that spiritual communities manifest in regards to time. And partly spiritual communities like the Sangha encapsulate an idealized version of the past. And there's something that people like to look back to and to think, oh, this is who we are, this is where we come from, this is our true values. It's been corrupted by modernity. So people want to hold on to those forms. And very understandably, right? I mean, it really is the case that cultures are being erased by modernity, and that so much of what gave individual peoples meaning is being lost, so people look to the Sangha as providing that continuity with the values and so on from the past. Of course, one of those values, unfortunately, is that women don't have much of a role, and they get kind of caught up in that. So, but the other dimension of a spiritual community is that spiritual communities should be leading. We should be setting an example, and we should be out in front and saying, this is the right thing to do. Let's aspire to doing better. And we see this in the ongoing issues in Australia with the Religious Discriminations Bill, where the government is sort of, at the behest of conservative religions, is wanting to institutionalise discriminative behaviours to protect religions, so they can continue to discriminate when the rest of society has moved on. And so, to me, this is a kind of a betrayal of what religions should be doing. We should be in front of people, setting an example and calling out people to be better.
So we all should be campaigning against that bill that I think is now in the lower house, right?
Yeah. And look, I know a lot of people here have been doing things about that, but yeah, that's definitely an example. Yeah.
You speak a lot about, if I can say this, fighting the patriarchs, and something that intrigued me was this idea of the patriarchy and a real estate, right, which leads to this really deeply ingrained culture.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit about what you mean?
Yeah, like one of the reasons that came about was, I guess, two things. I think one of the things is that when we talk about the patriarchy, it's very easy for it to get very vague. So, and of course, that there's some truth to that. I mean, patriarchy is embedded in cultural norms and values and expressions and so on, which are in fact vague and hard to define. But if you want to do something about it, then I think it's helpful to sort of point to something which is very concrete and very real. And the most concrete and real thing is real estate. And this is something that was really driven home to me after the whole Ajahn Brahm's ordination kerfuffle, where like the very first thing that in the meeting where they called Ajahn Brahm, they kicked him out of Wat Pah Pong, and then the very next thing is that one monk raised this saying, how can we get control of Bodhinyata's monastery away from him? The very first thing. Yes, that was the first word. Then they formed a committee, and the whole committee, like 8 or 10 monks, went down to Bangkok, and they made a press conference. They accused Ajahn Brahm of temple mismanagement. which is a Thai euphemism meaning corruption, basically siphoning off monastery funds. And they demanded that the Thai government repatriate the land of Bodhinyana Monastery. And and again, you know, and in addition, they had a petition. Another thing they did, petition. So they had local people in Perth standing outside the Buddhist Society at Ajahn Brahm's talks, collecting petitions to have Ajahn Brahm kicked out of his monastery so that they could reclaim the monastery for themselves. It's not just an occasional thing, right? It was a concerted long-term campaign by many people to take away the land, which, of course, belonged to the people of Perth, who had paid for it. It didn't belong in any way, shape or form to the Thai government. And it wasn't just Bodhinyana. There was a campaign to do the same thing to monasteries all over the world, which was very successful. And many monasteries in the world did, in fact, around that time, were quite deliberately taken away from control of their local communities and put into control of Sangha hierarchy in another country. And that was done, again, quite deliberately to exclude Bhikkhuni ordination. And so this is how I saw from that thing, that's how you do it, right? You control the land, and then when Bhikkhunis don't have a place to stay, then what can they do? And that's the ultimate seat of power, is being able to have an actual seat.
Do you see that changing at all? Because that's quite recent when all that happened.
That was about 10-something years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you mean has anything changed within?
Well, is there a sort of a lessening of the power of the monks, the Sangha monks wanting power, or?
Not really. No. I mean, what tends to happen at that? You know, obviously this is like one group of monks who are involved in kind of doing that. It's not all of them, but once this is the thing, and this is what we're kind of seeing a lot in the kind of the wider cultural sphere in recent years and recent decades, you know. And I think that we kind of naively thought that people would gradually sort of get it. Yeah, I think this is kind of the liberal delusion. We think that people are going to get it, and sure, some people do, of course, but then a lot of people just don't. And once they've taken that path, then it can become even more and more hardline. So, you know, again, I wouldn't say that's true of everyone, obviously, but there is a lot of truth to that. So, you know, as time goes on, I would expect that most of these places will become more hardline rather than otherwise.
Well, that's scary. But taking a step back, can you tell us a bit about that first ordination in Perth, and you know, why did Ajahn Brahm sort of go against the establishment to do that?
Okay, well, first of all, given that Ajahn Wayama just passed away, let's not erase her role in it. You know, she organised it and agreed on it and started it together with Ajahn Brahm, and it was their idea. For many years, when I knew her, Ajahn Wayama, like many of the women who ordained under like a 10 precept ordination, she was happy with that, and she thought, no, this is the way that we should be doing it, and we shouldn't necessarily be doing Bhikkhuni ordination. And that's what she said to me when I first knew her back in the 90s. But obviously she changed over time, and Ajahn Brahm changed over time, as many of us changed over time. And so she and Ajahn Brahm decided to go ahead with doing this Bhikkhuni ordination. I wasn't sort of involved directly at that time. I was at Santi, and you know, they told me about it, invited me to come over, but it was their decision. And their idea, which obviously didn't work, okay, but the idea was, let's do a small, quiet little ordination, just inviting a few people along and not make a big fuss or a big deal about it. And the Sangha, the Wat Pah Pong Sangha, was in fact supposed to be coming to Perth for a Sangha meeting later in that year. And Ajahn Brahm was, you know, all for that. And he said, well, look, let's just do the ordination, and then when all the monks come here and so on, we can discuss it and sort out all the details and so on. And Ajahn Brahm, I love him to bits. He is very focused on the glass half full. Let's just put it that way. And in this particular occasion, the glass turned out to be a little half empty as well. So the reaction to it was not at all what we expected. And the vitriol of the response was, I think, really quite shocking to many of us. Yeah.
Mm. Yes, around Australia. Look, there's a question that's come in from Clara Lynn. Hope that's how you pronounce it. That's relevant. She's asking, why don't more Western monks challenge the status quo?
You'd have to ask them. There's some more Western monks on here. They can maybe answer, but I don't know if they're appropriate. But look, I think people are people. What can I say? I think that sometimes it's because people are. It's an easy life. It's easy to go along. It's hard to question the people that you're with. I mean, let me just kind of put it out there. There are not a small proportion, not everyone, but not a small proportion of people who end up as monks in a monastery because they have issues with women and can't handle, whatever urges or whatever experiences they've had, which, look, fair enough. I mean, that's humanity. We're all messed up in one way or another, but it does influence decisions in some ways. Obviously, again, that's not everybody, but then it gets encoded in a monastery culture which only really allows certain forms of speech to be said. And there's a long pattern going back many years where this discussion was brought up. Like before 2000 and before the ordination we did, there was like a decade's worth of discussion where this had been sort of sidelined and minimized and put down, and where various monks had tried to bring it up and tried to raise it. And I spoke to a lot of monks at the time who were quite shocked to find the responses that they got. I'll just give you one example of that. When one of the stories that Ajahn Brahm told me years ago, so this early 90s probably, late 80s, early 90s, when they were first starting the 10 Precept Siladhara order in England. He was in England then, and Ajahn, he was on his way back to Thailand. Ajahn Sumedho asked him to, they wanted to start the Siladhara order with 10 Precept nuns, which was a kind of an innovation and a step forward at the time, and which Ajahn Sujato was treating as a stepping stone to Bhikkhuni ordination at the time. But so Ajahn Sumedho asked Ajahn Brahm, can you go back to Thailand and can you just talk, mention that we're doing this to the Sangharaja, the head of the Sangha in Thailand, and just get his blessing for it so we can make sure that we're doing it all properly? He said, sure. So he went back, went to see the Sangharaja, told him about this, and Sangharaja just looked furious, blurted out, women can't be monks, got up and stormed out of the room. Mm-hmm. So that's that. And then the later mythology became, oh yes, the Siladhara order was blessed by the Sangha in Thailand. Right? So this is what people believe. Anyway.
Bhante Akaliko has put something in the chat room. Would you like to say something, Bhante? No, well, he's just saying he's a feminist, and which we thank you for, and supports women and full ordination. Yeah. And he knows lots of other monks who do that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And everywhere, and this really isn't a kind of a Western versus Asian thing, as is often depicted. And this is one of the most sort of, I find it quite distressing ways that these things are depicted, that actually there's plenty of monks all over the world who are, quite sad to see the kinds of discrimination that's going on.
Can I ask generally, why is it important that we have nuns in monasteries and nuns in the Dharma? And, what do you see as their role? Sort of the big picture question.
Well, as was said when Mahapajapati was seeking ordination, there's the whole kind of becoming an arahant thing and getting enlightened. So there's that, right? And that's what the Sangha is there for. The Sangha is there to support spiritual practice and support people to let go of suffering and support people to find freedom. And if we can do that, then that's what the Sangha is for. And it's easy to forget that the Sangha is meant to serve liberation, and it's not meant to be a hindrance to it. But in addition to that, then of course there are sort of multiple other things. I mean, purely from a psychological point of view, to me, it's just incomplete. There's something psychologically wrong and unbalanced among the men when the women aren't accepted as equals.
Yeah.
And at just a talk just the other day, Bhikkhu Bodhi was saying that it's like an elephant with 3 legs, and it's just there's always going to be something crippled. Yeah. But even in addition to that, then there's also the positive role that having women in the Sangha has in supporting communities in all kinds of ways, both subtle and overt. And, wherever you go, when you see nuns communities, then they are working with and supporting people around them in all kinds of different ways that monks can't always do.
Yeah.
And then finally, the other thing that is really, because the theme of the topic of believing women was that it also helps the Sangha, because it also helps for the monks to be accountable.
Nice message from the Dhammasara nuns that the Adelaide Sri Lankan monks support Bhikkhuni ordination as well. And we've also got a message here from Judas, making a parallel with what Buddha Dharma, which where nuns and women were very welcome, and where people like Aikima and Venerable Chikwan and Vayama spent years in training. So, there are places where women and nuns are very supported.
Where they were very supported, of course, offered by Aikema, that land there.
True.
Yeah. One of the things that I saw in my life also as a monk, again, you see these kind of little things that you only kind of realize the significance of it much later. When I was a young monk in Thailand, so this was about 95, it was normal at that time for the white-robed Meiji to go for alms round together with the monks. And that we'd been doing that ever since I'd been going alms round. Mm-hmm. And there was always, the Meijis would be coming for alms round with us. And that had been under Ajahn Chah, that had been kind of a thing that had been happening, and not a big problem. Then this word comes down, the Meijis can't go for Pindabata anymore, can't go for alms round anymore. And that comes down from the head monastery. And we're like, why is that, or what's going on? And we never really learn why or have any consultation or anything like that. But you could see, even at that time, and that was a year or two after Ajahn Chah died, that, gradually the innovations that he made were being rolled back. And so this is what happens if you don't sort of make a continuous effort, that these things will be undone.
Bhante, can we go back to the Buddha's time, and what is there in the teachings about this issue, and also, the Vinaya, the rules in regards to conduct between men and women? What did the Buddha say?
Well, Buddha said all kinds of things. So there's lots of stuff in the Vinaya and so on. But one of the things is that if we look, again, we find that there tends to be a very particular lens through which people see these things. So that if there are monks or patriarchs who are really trying to do it, they'll find the worst things they can find and then say this is absolute truth and sort of put their foot down on that. Over the whole, then you find that there's actually much better. The picture of the nun's life that you get from their words in the Therigatha is quite different impression than you might get if you just read, say, the Bhikkhuni Vinaya, which is more the impressions of what the monks think the nuns ought to be doing. And I know Venerable Vimalanyani has been doing some research around that area herself. And so there's very easy to shift a narrative. It's also sorry, there's one more thought I was going to. So it's also the case that within the monks' Vinaya that we have several rules which are there for protection to stop the monks from exploiting the nuns, and probably the most one of them, for example, is a rule that says that monks can't ask nuns to do their laundry for them, which might sound like a bit silly, right? But if you're in a Thai monastery, this is the kind of the normal thing, that the Mechi will be doing the laundry for the monks.
And that's from the Buddha's time.
That's from the Buddha's time, yeah. The Buddha said you cannot ask the nuns to be doing your laundry for you.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And so there's a number of rules like that. Another rule says that a monk shouldn't be accepting alms food from a bhikkhuni, because bhikkhunis get less offerings than the monks do. So only if a layperson has already intended it for the monks, then it's okay. But if it's from a bhikkhuni's own food, because they were so kind that they were giving away their food to the monks, even though they didn't have enough for themselves. So there's these rules which show that there was a sense of that protection. And probably the most important one is the Aniyata rules, which is where the idea of believing women comes from. That if a trustworthy laywoman, in this case, makes an accusation of sexual misconduct against a monk, then that monk should be examined and should be treated according to the accusation of the laywoman. And so this was the bit of research that I did on there, and it's an interesting rule because it seems to be the only case in the Vinaya where a monk can be found guilty of a particular offence without necessarily confessing it. And he does so on the testimony of a trustworthy laywoman. And that has created a interpretive quagmire, as you could understand, for various commentators who try to understand and explain it in different ways. So this is the article that I did for the Buddha Dhamma magazine a little while ago, and just sort of having a look at the different way that people have treated that rule. And so, but it does seem quite clear that the original intent of the rule was that if there's a trustworthy laywoman, then the monk should be treated according to the accusation that she makes.
Mm. You mentioned the Therigatha, the poems of the early nuns, and certainly if you want to see the early nuns' inspiration, it's well worth reading. But I think it gained quite a bit of publicity with a recent translation, but I think you had a few problems with that.
The recent
as some others did.
The recent non-translation that was being marketed as a translation, yes.
Yeah.
There was this fellow in California, Matty Weingast, who wrote a book of poetry and then sold it, poetry loosely inspired by the Therigatha, and then sold it as a translation. It was being marketed by Shambhala Publications as a translation of the Therigatha.
Yeah.
But we were alerted to this by Bhikkhuni Sudhamma. And she wasn't the first to notice it by any means. In fact, they had been repeatedly noticed even before they published it that there was something going wrong here. Anyway, so she pointed out actually there's like 95% of it is just made up. It's not a translation at all. And yet it had been put around there's all of these Buddhist teachers who are sort of gushingly talking about how this is representing authentic feminine voices and the genuine, real experiences of the ancient bhikkhunis and how relatable it was and all of these kinds of things. And like, dude, it's relatable because it was written by a guy in California a couple of years ago. And
so beware.
So this was a classic example where women's voices were being literally taken away from them.
Yeah.
And their experiences were being removed. Like the experiences of the bhikkhunis were systematically removed from the text. And you find again after again in many cases that the bhikkhunis would be giving this celebration of their struggles and their attainments, their achievements and their enlightenment. And yet that would be replaced by this kind of self-doubting woman who was talked about only in relation with the men in her life, like her past husband or something like that, and who, it was so strange to me, and to see that clear song of liberation had been gone,
changed. Yes.
Yeah, and this is supposedly feminist. Anyway,
yeah. Venerable Choki's got a question. Choki, would you like to join in, or do you want me to read it for you?
You can just read it. I think it's self-evident.
Okay. So Choki's asking you, isn't it also holding as many vows as we can hold in this life?
That is not self-evident to me. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that, Venerable.
Well, it comes back to those of us who wish to take for ordination.
Right.
And, well, maybe it's not self-evident because I was told, are you going to keep all those vows? And I thought, well, I don't know that the monks get asked that, I mean, of course you get asked formally you get asked, but, it was that question. And if it is about whether we're lay or ordained, sort of by maintaining that ethical discipline and then on the basis of vows, otherwise why do we take vows?
Yeah.
To strengthen that and make it, as much as possible in our mind stream.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And, the whole thing about Bhikkhuni ordination is that it's not something we're forcing on people, but it's if people want to and they're ready to and the supporting conditions are there, then they should have that option. That's all. But yeah, you're quite right. There's definitely a double standard, and, you see that still like constantly today. And, if you see a bhikkhuni who will follow the Vinaya and not cover her shoulder, then she'll be criticized for that. But if I'm breaking the Vinaya and wearing a t-shirt, which is technically against the Vinaya, then I'm not going to be held accountable for that. Same with you nuns there at Dhammasara. You're wearing jackets. There's a kanchika. This is technically against the Vinaya, all right? So, but I'm not going to do that because there is a long and ignoble history of men commenting on women's bodies and clothes and appearances, and I'm not going to do that. This is the reality, and it's not just a comment, but there are, organized campaigns of bullying and all these kinds of things as well. It's kind of horrifying.
Another question. Oh, sorry.
Please.
Another question from, I think it's Viveka. How is it that nuns in the Therigatha were able to practice in seclusion and other things that appear to be against the current Bhikkhuni Vinaya and not be expelled?
Yeah, good question. Yeah. Okay, well, for a first thing is that, not breaking the Vinaya doesn't get you expelled. I mean, you have to try pretty hard if you want to get
really
expelled.
Bad things, right? And is that the same for monks and nuns? Is it the same standard?
Not quite. No, there are some extra expulsion rules for nuns as opposed to monks.
Yep.
Which we could go into at the moment. But anyway. So, but yes, you're quite right, and this I was kind of alluding to. In the Therigatha, you have someone like Bhadakundala Kesa, who's like boasting that she wandered across Anga and Magadha and all of the countries of India, and talking about how just celebrating her independence and her strength to be able to do that. And yet in the Vinaya, then it says, you shouldn't travel without a companion and so on. And so there is that dichotomy. And I'm sure that part of that is to do with, partly it's to do with different perspectives. You can see differences between, in the monks also, like the suttas and the Vinaya also can have some differences. So partly it's just a different perspective, but it's also that the Bhikkhuni Vinaya was compiled somewhat later and often is seen through the lens of the monks who were controlling the compilation process. So again, for those of you who are not necessarily that familiar with the textual situation here, I'll just sort of outline it very briefly. When we talk about the Vinaya, we're talking about monastic conduct. And there were a set of rules and procedures which were laid down presumably by the Buddha and which for the most part are similar across all the schools of Buddhism. And this we call the Patimokkha and various other procedures like ordination procedure and so on. Now, around that core of rules and principles, there grew a substantial mass of explanations, definitions, background stories, narratives, examples, and so on. And that mass is what we call the Vinaya Pitaka or the Vibhanga, which we have at the moment. So this is the canonical Vinaya text. Only the core of it probably comes from the Buddha's time. The other part was assembled over the next few hundred years. And when we compare that assembled material from the different schools of Vinaya, we find that that's usually different, or very often different. Wimala would know more about this than me, but I think that's normally the case. The Patimokkha rules, the core rules, are usually similar and rarely different. But the mass of explanatory material is often different. And so that means it was assembled at a later time, and it was assembled through the process, primarily through the process of redaction, which was controlled by the monks. Whereas the Therigatha has the voices of the women and is not subject to that same kind of process of expansion.
A question from the Dhammasara nuns, saying, then there is the question of what a Sankachika. We might need to hear from the nuns on this one.
Sorry, what have we got here? Oh, Sankachika.
Oh, sorry.
My spelling might have been a bit dodgy.
Sorry.
Oh, what is a Sankachika? You want to know what a Sankachika is?
Well, I'm assuming the Buddha didn't have a tailor and a sewing machine.
Yeah, it seems a reasonable assumption. Yes.
Yeah.
Aya Vimlanyani, do you have any thoughts on Sankachika?
Well, obviously there's a lot of discussion on this, and people are experimenting with this. And according to the Vinaya, what the Vibhanga says is that it's a cloth that covers from the collarbone to above the belly button. So very clearly it didn't cover the arms, or it didn't cover the shoulders. It was just meant to, well, cover the private parts and cover what needs to be covered, basically. And also we see in the Vinaya that cloth was really, really difficult to come by for most people. So they wouldn't have made it bigger than it was necessary in order to cover, the chest area. So people are experimenting with this in all sorts of ways. And most people just think that any kind of chest cover basically would fulfill the requirements of the Vinaya. And the Vinaya very clearly doesn't seem to include anything that covers the arms. So I feel like people can experiment with this a little bit, and people's bodies are different and women's bodies are different. So the kind of support that people need might also be different. So I feel like maybe it's also up to the individual nun to come up with something that works for her and that is appropriate for her kind of body.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bhante, do you have any comment?
No, sounds good.
Yeah. We've also got on the chat room, I recommend you perhaps go there and copy the link from Venerable Akaliko, who recommends Aya Vimalanyani YouTube channel for in-depth and fascinating discussions about the lives of the enlightened senior nuns from the time of the Buddha. And there's a YouTube link there. So maybe you could just copy that while you're online. Getting back to the topic of this talk, which was believing women, and you say the Buddha would have believed you, but it seems the Sangha, the senior Sangha, the patriarchy, as you say, do not believe women. Why have women not been believed?
Well, they have some stories to tell, don't they? And that's really the reason, and it's one of the things that I'm going to go into is that I mean, the purpose of patriarchy is to deprive women of power and a voice, and because men like to do things without having any repercussions, and some men like to hurt women. That's just the reality of it. And so you need to have systems that will just silence women's voices and disable them. On that, it's worth noting that there was some legislation being passed in New South Wales and Victoria as we speak, which is going somewhat of a way to redress that, giving stronger standards for consent in sexual activities and so on. So there are some changes, but it is far too slow. And there's so many problems in the whole area. And obviously I'm far from being an expert in any of these things, but I think that it's important to have men who are kind of within the system, if you like, sort of speaking up about it, and that just to at least to sort of acknowledge the fact that this is a reality, and it's not just going to go away because of wishful thinking. It will only go away when men are held accountable.
Why do you think we see this problem where men right at the top, who are seen as the spiritual leaders, are often abusing their power, particularly when it comes to nuns? Why? Yeah. Why is that? I mean, it happens in other religions as well. Why do you think we see that?
Yeah, because there is a darkness in the hearts of men. And, you know, the Buddha was talking about there's greed, hate, and delusion. And when you put that into a system that grants you power that is unimpeachable and does not allow you to be questioned, then those dark forces will manifest. And this is one of the things, is we have to stop being surprised by this. We have to stop thinking that it's an exception. We have to stop thinking that, oh, it won't happen for our monks. Of course it will. Of course it will happen for your monks and your group or whatever it is. I mean, maybe it's happening already and you don't already know. Or maybe if it's not, it will eventually, because that's why those structures are there. That's why we have patriarchies that silence women's voices and deprive women of power.
So you say there's a darkness in the heart in spite of studying the Dharma?
Oh, God, yes.
Okay.
I mean, you know, again, there's degrees, right? I mean, you have people like Chogyam Trungpa or Sogyal Rinpoche who were, you know, rapists and predators and destroyed the lives of so many people. And, you know, that's a level of kind of dissociation which is hard to comprehend. And like, that's again how that works when you have these kinds of people doing, they operate because nobody can believe that somebody in that position could be doing those things, and yet quite obviously they are. And, you know, we've seen cases, and, you know, so many public cases in recent years when people who have been, you know, terrible sexual abusers then get elected to president, who get put on the Supreme Court, who, you know, and it's just, that's how it works. You know, that's how the system works.
And looking at the monasteries, obviously you have the monks who take a vow of celibacy, and yet you've written very eloquently that if these are broken, the women are blamed.
Yes, obviously.
Why? Why is it always the women?
Because of power. Yeah. And
the Sangha doesn't take the accusation seriously?
Yeah. I mean, again, look, that's obviously not always the case, and obviously there are cases where these things are taken seriously, and, you know, can be handled, you know, to a certain degree, well or badly. And I know of cases where that has happened. But it's also the problem with the institution of patriarchy is that then whether that happens or not is entirely basically up to the choice of the monks. And you can say, oh yeah, well, the monks did the right thing. Well, okay, they did the right thing because they felt like it. And they might not have felt like it, in which case it wouldn't have done the right thing. So this is why that system, the whole monks account, it shouldn't be your choice. And that's why, you know, you do find the laws are becoming more progressive, and, you know, you do have like mandatory reporting and so on in certain situations in Australia. And it shouldn't be your choice as to whether these things are allowed to go on or not. And so this is really where it comes in, you know, and I do know of cases where there was sexual abuse in the Sangha among monks where they were handled very well, and where they invited Bhikkhunis to be part of the group that dealt with it, and it was handled in a very very constructive way, you know. So it does happen, but it can't be something that's just left up to happenstance.
So spiritual communities are starting to address the problem.
Yeah. Well, it's starting smarting. I mean, again, this is why you keep pointing back to the Vinaya. So these problems have been there all along, and people have been dealing with them all along. So it's not that we're just starting. It's just we're another generation of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got comments from the nuns and for the nuns. So from the nuns, Santachari, how to address the internalized oppression by women. The most objections I've received have been from women.
Right, yeah. So Santachari, I'm just sort of having a look around for you. Where are you now?
Second from the bottom.
Anyway, trying to see you there. Anyway, I can't see you, but anyway, welcome. Yeah, so this is another thing. Again, this is something that I'm obviously not sort of really an expert about, but I always remember from, what was the name? A Different Voice. She wrote the book A Different Voice. Anyway, I'll remember it in a second. She said that patriarchy divides men against women and divides women against each other. And that
interesting.
That's really important to remember.
Yeah. So
when you see these things, then it's not just if you see that there are women who are acting against stopping women from doing it, it's not because women are unable to support each other or anything. It's because they're in a patriarchal system that motivates that kind of behavior. Why? Because obviously it rewards women who will be on the side of the patriarchy. So if you stick by the monks, then you're in their good books, and the ones who don't are the bad nuns or the bad women.
Okay, thanks. And the questions for the nuns is, could you please let me know if you feel you have more freedom after your ordination or more freedom as a laywoman to study and practice the Dharma? And would you ever want to go back as a laywoman? I don't know if the nuns want to answer. Would someone like to unmute, and perhaps from Dhammasara or...
Sure, if any of the nuns want to respond to that.
Choki's got an answer. We can perhaps start off with Venerable Choki.
Yeah, I've definitely got an answer. It's very clear. And definitely more opportunity. Absolutely, there's no question, more opportunity for me anyway in my life to study and practice and teach. Because of teaching, I study a lot. So, yeah, definitely. Life's much simpler, shall we say.
So you can just hone in on the teachings and don't have to worry.
Well, as you know, I do some other things.
Yes, yes, I do.
But
you do a lot of other things.
Right? It's all done.
Would the Dhammasara nuns like to, or Vimalana Bhikkhu like to add to this? No. Okay. Okay, and then Bhante Sujato, a question, interesting question from Tamaha. Where is karma, and why does it allow these men to continue their terrible actions against women?
Where is karma?
I'm not quite sure what she means either, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, where is it?
Being created all the time.
Yeah, that's right. Karma's created all the time, and yeah, I mean, I don't imagine that people are creating good karma by doing these kinds of things. Quite the contrary. But karma is a complicated thing, and this is interesting. That okay, so come back to what I was talking about before with the Vinaya. Right? So when the Buddha was a very practical person. And like when we see how he dealt with a community and he dealt with the problems that people found in a community, then he would deal with them by addressing the problem in a very straightforward way. Somebody's robe was getting torn on a nail in their kuti. He'd say, make sure you don't have nails protruding from your kuti walls. This kind of thing, right? So he wouldn't just fob people off by saying, oh, yes, you should have been more mindful, right? If you tore your robe on a nail, he'd say, well, hammer the nail in. He didn't say, be more mindful. Yeah? So the Buddha was always addressing problems in a practical manner and not fobbing people off with spiritual bullshit. And this is something that, I'm sorry, Aya, you're acting as if you're not an Australian and you're not used to this kind of language. I'll go moving along. Anyway, anyway, so sorry, I'm just remembering back to the good old days when Ajahn Brahm and I used to be in negotiations with various people, and we had a code word, the Gomayang, which is the Pali for bullshit, when we thought that people weren't being straight with us, that we would use. Anyway, so where was I? Oh, yeah, so karma is another thing, right? So the Buddha would never, if somebody did something wrong, the Buddha would never say, oh, your karma will get you. We don't have to worry about that, right? The Buddha is saying, no, we have to address this problem and we have to solve the problem here and now. And it's interesting and very telling that in the Buddhist monastic code by Bhikkhu Thanissaro, who was famously one of the driving forces opposing Bhikkhuni ordination, that when it came to this rule, the Aniyata rule about leaving women, then he acknowledged that even though, in his words, the original intent of the Buddha had been that the women should be believed, still, he recommended that the woman should not be believed, right? Arguing that the karma would get them eventually. And this was the only place in his book where he made that kind of argument. Yeah? So, yeah, he's right. Karma will get them, but that's not an excuse for not doing the right thing. And so that's our responsibility.
As Buddhist women, as nuns, what do we need to do to get things to change? What can we do? And one of your articles talks about an imaginarium. So can nuns and Buddhist women imagine a better future?
Yeah, I really like that talk. I love that title, The Imaginarium of the Nuns. One of my favorite titles that I ever came up with. Because it's about like the difference between the idea of the fourfold sangha or the idea of a nuns, which is this very kind of projected and idealized thing, either revered or perhaps feared as well, right? And so that thing, and then of course there's the living reality of people getting on with their lives. So if you're asking, what can women do? Well, get on with your lives, live a good life, practice the Dhamma, and that is the foundation for all of the things that come from this. But I think it is important to have some sort of ability to reflect on the mechanisms by which the patriarchy works, because, again, from that experience that I referred to back at the start, where you're kind of put into a gendered box when you come into a monastery, and to know why that is and sort of how to handle that, and to not buy into it. So there's on the one hand there's a reality that we live in a world where certain things are the way they are, and we can't just imagine everything better. We can't just live in another world. So, but at the same time, we don't have to buy into just thinking, well, it has to be like this and nothing can change. So when you're seeing those kinds of forces and when you're seeing those kinds of tendencies, for example, the tendency to dismiss and marginalize the voices of women who maybe complain about the system, or that tendency to treat the behaviors and the speech and so on of the monks in a different way than you might of somebody else, and so on. All of these kinds of things, these are ways that it's good to just be alert to, and just to remember to support each other, and to always just have compassion. And a good guideline for me, is you always always support the one who doesn't have power. And doesn't mean that people who don't have power can't make mistakes, but as a rule of thumb, that's always healthier.
Thank you. Let's go back to questions. And Venerable Mitaji says, can we touch on new supportive initiatives, the Oath Against Harm, the proposed ethical standards framework from the ASA? Would you like to comment on those?
Venerable, do you want to speak? Is he around? Oh, no, he is. Venerable, do you want to speak to those things?
Thank you, and thanks for everybody's questions, and Bhante Sujato for your wise words of wisdom. I'm a bit positive in terms of the desire for monks and males to be more supportive. I think there are enough good men to start with that want to stand alongside the nuns and women and make a difference in Australia. I think the Sakyadhita conference, where a number gave a presentation about the issues at Rigpa, which then led to the Alliance of Buddhist Ethics, and then led to the Oath Against Harm. So in a number of places now, there's a desire that the monastics and the lay teachers take the oath against harm. We've been working with Sakyadhita and others to come up with an ethical standards framework that would reach out as far as the lay teachers, and the oath against harm, would be included in that. And from my perspective, I'm old in years, but fairly young as a monk. I do see that probably 50 or 60% of those coming to Bodhinyana now are feminists and saying, how do we support the nuns in a way that's acceptable to the nuns? And in my personal story, I wanted to go and ask my daughter's permission to be a monk. And if I was not supporting the nuns, then she'd make my life pretty hard. And there was an old stager monk in the Thai forest tradition who said, you're doing the wrong thing, you're joining the wrong team. And I said, that's interesting. I've decided to go to Bodhinyana because they did ordain nuns.
Right.
Now, I think there's enough of us that want to support and have everybody on an equal playing field and stand there and make action that is supportive of change. And I see that from the younger generation and from those feminist supporters amongst the males. I'm fairly encouraged that something can happen strongly in Australia in the next couple of years, and perhaps then that can go wider afield.
Thank you for all your work. We really appreciate it. Bhante Sujato?
Nothing. Yeah, no, that sounds good to me. Yeah. Okay.
Venerable Shui is next. She's talking about, perhaps you'd like to unmute Venerable, but she's talking about many see the Vinaya as a constraint, but is it really? I can't see you, Venerable Shui. Are you there?
Hi, Helen. Hello. Hi.
Hi, Venerable.
Yes. No, I wasn't asking a question. I was just responding to the question earlier for, I'm just way behind everybody. That's all. I'm just responding to asking about Bhikkhunis, whether they feel freedom being a Bhikkhuni or whether they would find more freedom as a lay person. And I'm saying that the freedom is really about an inward sense of freedom rather than external. What appears to be the Vinaya that is so constraining is just an external form, but that external form is what's helpful for us in our inward road and our inner journey. Yeah. So whatever happens in the external circumstances, whether we are lay or monastic, we're going to face it, right? Whether it's aging, sickness, death, any unpleasant situations in our life. But what the Vinaya has helped us do is to be able to encounter these difficulties with that peace of mind. And that takes practice. And I believe that putting on the robes has helped me personally with that practice. It may be different from person to person.
Yeah.
Thank you, Venerable. A question from Lee. How can monks be fully enlightened with this discrimination still by lowering the ordination of women? I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah. Look, I mean, can you be enlightened and still sexist? Probably not. I don't think so, personally. When I was a monk, young monk in Thailand, and it's kind of part of the culture. I don't know if it's quite the same with the nuns or whatever, but certainly when I was in the forest tradition, the part of the kind of the culture is like who's got what. Oh yeah, this monk's like an anagami, this monk's like an arahant, or I was going to go and practice with him, but it turns out he was just a stream winner, so no, I'm not going to go. Whatever, these kinds of things, and it's like my monk's more enlightened than your monk or something. Now, and at a certain point, there were various opinions about, especially Ajahn Buddhadasa, who one of the more controversial monks in modern Thailand, who taught sort of a version of a kind of one lifetime dependent origination, which gained him a lot of notoriety. And sort of one highly reputed monk who was supposed to have psychic powers and so on said that Ajahn Buddhadasa was an arahant, and another very highly reputed monk who also was supposed to have some psychic powers and so on said that Ajahn Buddhadasa was in hell. So not being neither highly enlightened nor possessed of psychic powers, I was unable to adjudicate on that particular issue. And I couldn't help but thinking that perhaps the reality might be a little bit more nuanced than that. But this is where you kind of begin to realize that, you know, a lot of these kinds of discussions are really kind of groundless speculation, and they're not actually really wholesome. The Buddha was quite down on people who would, you know, try to speculate about people who are more spiritually advanced than they were. So for me, the thing is, well, you know, just to try to look at what's wholesome and unwholesome in myself and to try to do better. You know, we can't judge the state of enlightenment of others. It certainly is true that humanity is complicated and people can have strengths and weaknesses and wisdom and blind spots and so on. You'd think that that's not going to be the case with somebody who's enlightened or very far on the spiritual path. Hopefully that would be the case. But yeah, I mean, look, for myself, you know, if I knew that there was a monk who held, you know, quite sexist views, then, you know, I'm not going to be going to them for wisdom and spiritual advice, that's for sure.
And Lee goes on with another question. It seems karma doesn't affect them, but to only women who's responsible for this, and when? Again, I'm not quite sure about that.
Well, I think that the karma does affect them, but maybe we just don't see that, right? So we don't necessarily see how the karma is working out and how it's playing out. But yes, you're quite right. This is the injustice and the unfairness that the men, you know, sometimes will do the bad thing, and it seems like the women will suffer from shame, suffer from being ostracized, suffer from trauma, suffer from internal feelings of guilt, and all of those kinds of things. Yeah. And the men seem like they're fine, you know. And again, patriarchy is there so that that's possible. That's why patriarchy exists. And we've got to get beyond this kind of idea of thinking that patriarchy is just something that happens. It doesn't just happen. It's built, and it's built for a purpose. And there's a reason why all the courts are patriarchy. And there's a reason why all the governments are patriarchies. And there's a reason why all the universities are patriarchies. And there's a reason why all the militaries are patriarchies. And there's a reason why we build things in a way that are clubs of men who get together and hoard power to themselves. And in every one of those cases, where was the time when the men collectively got together and said, hey, actually, this is wrong, let's give the power to women? No, it doesn't happen like that. It happens because of a long, long, long struggle. And, you know, you take steps forward and you take steps backwards. And, you know, I do agree with, you know, with what Venerable Metaji was saying, that I do think that there are, within the Sangha, I think that there are steps forward on the whole. I think that there are, you know, there's movements forward and movement backwards, but I think on the whole, definitely moving in a better direction. And we have now, in the forest tradition, we have what, 1, 2, 3, 4 Bhikkhuni monasteries in Australia, 4 or 5. Anyway, a few.
Santi, Dhammasara,
Newbury, Matarama here in Sydney. What is it? Wyama and Sarah's place. I can't remember what they call it in Perth. So it's 5 places. 5, yeah. Anywhere else? So that's not bad. It's better than nothing.
And also from Lee.
Sorry, Santachari. Sorry, my bad. Oh, that's why I didn't see you before, because you're there, right? Oh, you're in Dhammasara. I didn't know. How is Perth treating you?
Hello.
Sorry, you're still muted, unfortunately. Sorry, still muted. No, got nothing.
We can't. Sorry, you're still muted. We can't hear you. Sorry.
Anyway, a thumbs up or thumbs down for Dhammasara. How's it going? We got a thumbs up or a thumbs down? Okay, very good. We got a whole these thumbs up. Okay, very good.
Okay, so Lee, Are you okay to continue, Bhante? We've sort of gone over time, but
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good.
Yeah, okay, good. Because there's more questions coming in. So Lee is asking lots of questions. First, what about the rain bodies? I'm sure this would affect them.
Yeah,
and then she goes, Buddhist monkhood should sustain respect for all Bhikkhuni order as equal rules and responsibilities.
Yes,
Lee, you're very welcome to ask these questions yourself.
Yeah, no, that's yes, definitely. Yes, I agree. That's definitely right. Venerable Chand.
It's lovely to see Venerable Chanda online from the UK, and she's and really welcome. And one Bhikkhuni, she's saying, in the UK, getting very tired after 6 years on my own.
My goodness.
Venerable Chanda, do you want to say anything?
Hello, everybody. I'm afraid I joined this late. I was given, I think, an hour.
Sorry if I mucked up the time.
Oh, no,
my
that's
bad.
okay.
My
it's
bad.
very nice to be here anyway.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
really nice to see other monastics, because I actually haven't seen another monastic, I think, only for like an hour and a half last week. And that was the first time in 2 years.
What?
So, yes, it's pretty.
Have you been on retreat? You've been on retreat?
I've just done my rains retreat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so every year I do my 3 months retreat, and usually that's in Australia. So of course, because of the coronavirus, I couldn't get over. So yeah, it's tough because even for the retreat, I feel like I'm having to create my own retreat conditions. It's not like we're moving into a container that's already set up for bhikkhunis over here. So it can get very tiring.
Yeah.
And I think, even with the strongest commitment and, the best of volitions, it's very hard to change a system by oneself. And of course, we have the monk support in Australia and various other places. I think the US is also doing pretty well in terms of Bhikkhuni ordination and supporting Bhikkhuni ordination. But in England, of course, it's very different because the dominant Sangha here took a very clear decision not to support Bhikkhuni ordination. And I think that does impact, I'm starting to feel that really does impact the Buddhist lay support and the whole Dhamma scene over here.
Right. Was that Ajahn Sumedho, or where did that come from?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the details sort of in a blow-by-blow way because I wasn't around at the time. I was still in Burma, and then I moved to Australia. But yeah, the Amaravati Sangha and the Wat Pah Pong Sangha basically took a decision against Bhikkhuni ordination, and then the Sangha in the UK came out with the 5 points, which is obviously history now, but it still, has its effect. And that basically means that the nuns who ordain in the monasteries in England have to take on those points, which means that they can never take full ordination, basically. And they're always going to be in a junior and subservient role to the monks. So they don't actually have autonomy around how they want to live their monastic life.
So what are these?
Ordain other nuns, for example.
What are these 5 points, Venerable?
Oh. Yeah, maybe Bhante Sujato could talk about that because you've written blogs on this.
It's been a while. I don't know if I can. Can you? I don't know. Can you remember them all? Like one of them is that. That 10 precept ordination is not a stepping stone to Bhikkhuni ordination,
yeah.
And then there's one that a nun should not speak in front of a monk, and that if a nun is invited by a monk to speak, then that cannot be taken as a precedent for allowing her to speak in front of a monk in future. They're very, very specific on that point. So there are a number of other inspiring and uplifting points of that don't at all speak to people who are deeply scared and challenged in their own kind of relationships to gender or whatever. But anyway, whatever. So I really, really feel for you there. You're doing it tough. Yeah.
Well, we're opening up. Australia's opening up, Venerable Chanda, so you can come back.
I'm watching the news.
The Dhammasara nuns are saying their audio problems are fixed. So can we hear from you? Yes, you're unmuted. No.
We got nothing.
Sorry. No. Okay, so another question from Lee. Being loud.
It is ironic, though.
Yes, I mean, it is in the context. It is. We feel for the Dhammasara. You can always write in the chat room.
Yeah,
it's not the same. Yeah, Jenny saying thank you, Venerable Chanda, and much metta. I've only just learnt about the UK situation. Someone's given a link to the 5 points. If yeah, lots of opposition in the UK. Sorry, there was a question from Lee.
I'm sure you know, but I haven't been to the UK. You know, when I was there, we didn't manage to go there because Ajahn Brahm edged me out. But I did visit. I did have a lovely time in Dublin, and the Irish folks were very supportive, and they were really great. So I don't know. I guess you've probably been over there. No. Oh.
No, I've not been to Ireland. I've sort of created my own community, really.
Okay.
Over here, mostly online. For the
well, that was with the Irish Sangha Trust, and they were really terrific, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, really great group of people. Yeah.
Okay, moving back to the question from Lee. Being loud to deaf ears is a dying Buddhahood. Things need to change for the life of the Buddha in respect of his knowledges.
No, it's not. That's unmuted. Oh, there we go.
Oh, there we are. Speak up
hey!
now.
Finally, we have not been silenced yet.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. There's been so many questions for you, I've forgotten.
I know. Sorry. Our poor laptop's a bit old.
I think the first one was, have you felt constrained being nuns? Is it easier to study the Dharma being a nun or being a laywoman?
Is that the question, or is it easier being a monk than being a nun?
No. Is it easier being a nun or a laywoman was a question that came in when it comes to studying the Dharma.
Oh, sorry, I'll let Venerable Pekka speak, but they can't come any close to you, so you have to come closer to the microphone.
Well, I mean, from my point of view, there's no doubt that it's much easier and much more wonderful being a nun. I've been here now 13 years, so obviously I like it. It's like the Bhikkhuni from Foguanchan, I think, was saying. It's the Nantian. Okay, Nantian. The simplicity and the so-called constraints actually give you a lot of time and freedom to find the more wholesome, the more sort of the correct way to deal with life, which comes from within, that peace that comes from within. And as a nun, I mean, that's what the whole business is about. So the whole thing is set up for us to grow in the Dhamma. I can't imagine why the question exists.
That's why I reframed the question. Okay, I've been listening to it. You have to come closer now. I didn't have a long enough cable for the microphone yet.
I actually wanted to say something about support and thank those monks who do support us, including the wonderful Bhante Sujato, because I see a clear dichotomy in Adelaide in my supporters. So the Sri Lankan temple supports me and the Thai temple clearly does not. And as a result of that, I have 60% Sri Lankan supporters, and the 40% of other supporters are inspired by Ajahn Brahm, Ajahn Sujato, and the pro-Bhikkhuni Western Sangha.
And Venerable Chanda. I had people say at Katina, Venerable Chanda was an inspiration.
Yeah, that too. So I very much see the very concrete impact on requisites alone, just the fact that I've actually get requisites, that somebody paid my flight here to Dhammasara so I can get some nun lifetime, which is seriously awesome. Thank you, Bhante Sujato. Having a great time here. And it's a very palpable and concrete difference whether we do have these wonderful gentlemen in the Sangha and, you know, in Parliament supporting our position, and the difference where they're not. So I have a great deal of sympathy for Venerable Chanda where she's clearly in a situation, and maybe you can find some nice Sri Lankan monks to help you out there. But certainly the Malaysian and Singaporean supporters, who are largely inspired by Ajahn Brahm and Bhante Sujato, are also a great source of support, and a bunch of, you know, obviously random white people. So that's, people often ask me, why are you a nun? And I became a nun pretty quickly after finding out it was actually possible. So my response to that usually is, and I don't know what the lady in the black shirt's name is, but I'm definitely going to put this question to you. Why aren't you a nun? That, you know, it's like
Helen, yeah.
Like, given you know it's possible, why are you not a nun? How would anybody if you could do it? Like, really, we have this wonderful protective fence around us, and that's how I see the vinaya, right? It protects me from the gross evils of the world, and then the more subtle the vinaya gets, the more subtle evils I'm protected from. Ayya Adimutta put it to me, actually, I was over 45 years of age when I became a nun. I was actually 49, and I went to the United States and trained with Ayya Loka. So actually, age is not an issue. Even if you're over 50, there are other options than Dhammasara in the world now.
I thought it was an issue, which would affect me.
Yeah, well, you can always go and train with Ayya Loka. She'll have you. You took me, and I was like pretty weird and horrible before I was a nun. I'm sure Bhante Sujato remembers that. Okay.
No comment, but yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ayya. I just wanted to pick up just one thing that you said about like the support from the different communities and so on. And one of the things just to bear in mind is that that's also very dependent on the particulars of the place. And so we can't necessarily generalize. In Australia, just again for a bit of sort of background for those people who might not know. So in Thailand, the Sangha is typically not actually particularly well organized, but they do exert quite a degree of control over monks who go overseas. And what they do is that they essentially split the overseas countries by Sangha, or by grouping in Thailand. So certain groups of monks will sort of be allocated to come to Australia, and certain other groups of monks will be allocated to go to different places. I don't know if it's the same in America, it's probably too big, but that's often how it is, certainly in Asia. Anyway, so the group of monks which comes to Australia is sent from Wat Asokaram, which is one of the Dhammayut forest monasteries in Thailand. It's the same circle of monks who also go to Indonesia. And so this is why you see that these are the kind of the mainstream Thai monks in Australia. It's not all of them. There are other monks outside of those circles, but that's the main monasteries in Australia, including the one in Adelaide that you're referring to. So these are all established from the same monastery in Thailand, and they're all part of the same circle of monks. And those monks are regularly instructed by Thailand that they must not support Bhikkhuni ordination. So this is definitely coming from the top, and this is something that we know. So again, you know, it's hard to say, you know, what does that mean in terms of who the individuals and the particular monks who are there or whatever, and what their beliefs are. They're told their visas and their presence in Australia is dependent on them not supporting Bhikkhuni ordination. The same thing is not true in other places. And just an obvious example being when I was in San Francisco, and IIT took me up to Jangka Mahaprasad's monastery. He's the most senior Thai monk in America, and he said he wanted to talk about the Bhikkhunis. And I said, oh dear, no, I'm in trouble now. And he said, you've done Bhikkhuni ordination in Australia? I said, yes. He said, well, we have a problem. He said, we don't have enough Bhikkhunis in Thailand. Can you send some of your Bhikkhunis from Australia to Thailand so that we can have more there?
Oh.
I said, well, we'll see how we're going, Lumpur, but we don't really have enough for Australia yet anyway. So again, it really depends on where you are and who you're with in the different circles. So yeah, so just as long as we kind of be aware of that. And the reason I just make this point is because people will often say, oh, you know, the Thais won't support Bhikkhunis or something like this. And my experience is always that it's much more nuanced than that. Yeah, there are hundreds of Bhikkhunis in Thailand, so obviously someone's supporting them.
Bhante, we're running well over time, but we've got more questions, and if you're happy to stay a little longer.
I'm happy to stay a little longer. I want to hear from Tenzin Palmo.
So do I. I'm not sure if she wants to speak. But while she's thinking about that, here's a question, a message actually from May. As a nun, what has been the most difficult resource challenge is finding the abode to stay. I hear of some nuns who end up having to stay in their own place where they which they kept prior ordination due to the lack of temple monastery.
Yeah, and this comes back to what I was saying before, that like one of the key mechanisms of the patriarchy is to control real estate. And you know, to control who can stay where. And
so are nuns being shut out? Or?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, there's policies on where you can stay and where you can't stay. And of course, there's two issues. One is whether you have a place to stay, and then the other is who gets to say that. Right? I mean, you might have monks who are running a monastery and they might say, oh, yes, we're very kind and magnanimous and we will let Bhikkhunis stay, but then they might decide something else and say, now we don't let Bhikkhunis stay. And so, you know, this is why the model from the Vinaya is very much that the Bhikkhunis are running their own monasteries. And they are building their monasteries. And we see many stories in the Vinaya about this, that they are dealing with contractors, with carpenters, with bricklayers, with people to actually build monasteries. And they are doing teachings and they are actually putting that whole thing together. And again, you know, this idea that the nuns were a kind of ineffectual adjunct to the bhikkhus just doesn't reflect the reality that's depicted in the Vinaya. Clearly, the Bhikkhunis were organized and effective, and clearly they had resources. And that's not something which is just located in the text of the Vinaya. It's also something which is more than supported by the archaeological record. So the archaeological record up till about 1,000 years or so after the Buddha represents Bhikkhunis in roughly the same amount and roughly the same roles that we find for bhikkhus. So I'm talking about the archaeology of ancient India. Now, most of the things that we find are things like donative inscriptions on like a statue or a stupa or something like that. And it will record this statue was donated by so-and-so together with so-and-so, funds raised by so-and-so, and it will give you the details of the offering of maybe a Buddha Rupa or a votive stupa or something like that. And frequently in those donations, they will say the donation has been organized or sponsored by a certain bhikkhu or a certain bhikkhuni, and it will say something about them. It might say that they're a teacher. When describing the bhikkhunis, it will use words like, say, ate Bhikkuni, which means a master of the Tripitaka, and it will say that she sponsored this together with whatever lay people of such and such a village or something like that. And so it shows that the bhikkhunis were in that leadership role where they had, you know, considerable resources to be able to make beautiful donations, where they were organizing lay communities, where they were mastering scriptures, where they were treated in those respectful roles. And that's, you know, over more than 1,000 years in India. And again, it's consistently in a proportion which is, roughly speaking, similar to that of the bhikkhus. So that's the traditional role. And so it's not until we have that, you know, it's not as if we're doing anything new here. That's how it was. And you know, also there's many kind of stories about these things, you know, if you look in the post Ashokan literature, books like the Ashoka some of the Mahayana sutras, and various other places, it will tell various stories that have a lot of very powerful and empowered female teachings, or like the the lives, the biographies of the Bhikkhunis from ancient China as well, being a great source of, amazing teachers and women who did a lot of incredible things. So these things have been there all along, and we need to honour that and continue that tradition.
Thank you. Venerable Chan is also saying that for me, the hardest part is having nowhere to stay, as well as poor access to teachings. Also, as Bhante said, not enough bhikkhunis, e.g. to get together in the West and support each other. Venerable Chan, do you want to say any more? Perhaps not.
I'm not sure I have a lot more to say, but I guess the main thing for me is just to point out that in a place where there is no Bhikkhuni Sangha, the Bhikkhuni Sangha hasn't actually arrived, we are not able to just walk into an established structure. We're having to create that structure. And for people like myself who ordained before realizing that, because I ordained in Burma, so there was a sort of system, at least for, the novice ordination, let's say. It's very difficult because we're already nuns, and it's a calling. For me, it's a calling. It's not something I even feel I chose. It's something that the path sort of took me toward. And so there's no question of disrobing. And yet I find myself without the requisite support to be able to actually live as a bhikkhuni in a way that's nourishing and in a way that actually enables me to fulfill my potential. So I just find that most of my days are busy with organizing the trust and the volunteer teams and doing a lot of admin and just trying to keep up some kind of daily practice. So it's difficult then to see that in monks' monasteries where they do have the support, they're flourishing, they're growing, they're developing, becoming good teachers. And in a way that just consolidates this notion, which maybe exists in patriarchy or in particularly sexist monks perhaps, that men are superior because they have the conditions where we don't. So it's kind of sad as a bhikkhuni to see so many other bhikkhunis who start off with all this faith and inspiration, and over time, because it's so tough, they just get worn down. So we're holding a lot, we're holding the sort of trying to bring structures together, put them in place, generate support and respect, and at the same time inspire others. So a lot is demanded of bhikkhunis, especially in places where there are not existing sanghas.
Perhaps too much.
Yeah, a lot of multitasking.
It is too much. It often feels too much, and I often feel on my edge of whether I can continue. But in a sense, there's no choice, because if we want this to change, somebody has to make those first steps.
Yeah. Like you said, it's a calling. It's not something that you can rationally explain, like why do you want to ordain or something like that. It's just there. It's just like it becomes who you are. So then you just have to deal with it. You're in that situation. Yeah, I wish that there was more that that we could do and we could offer you, and I can only I'm so sorry that you have to go through all that. Yeah, if it makes you feel better, if you stay in a monastery where everything's like really luxurious and you're given everything, then you end up being corrupt and lazy. So there's that as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's a chance to develop certain qualities.
Maybe a middle way might be a good idea. I don't know.
Yeah. You've got a lot of supporters here, Venerable Chan, but I don't know what we can do practically. Just join us.
I think formal seminars like this are fantastic support. So.
Yeah. Oh well, we'll do more, and we'll ask you to speak, as you know. Look, we have to wrap up soon, but we'd love to hear. We're very honoured to see that Tenzin Palmo is online. Tenzin, would you like to join us and perhaps comment on the monks' bikinis issue?
Well, of course, step at a time, what can you do? Here, the main problem is not just the resistance from the monk side, but also some resistance from the nun side. that they are nervous to put themselves forward to becoming bhikkhunis because they fear the controversy. As long as they stay novices and they're studying and now they're also teaching, then they feel that's enough because everybody respects that, everybody is happy to see them, and they feel they're learning a lot, and as I say now, also they're in the role of teachers. And many of them feel that's enough. And when one tries, I mean, just recently now in a certain place, they are going to, very high Lama is about to be giving the ordination for nuns. And many of the nuns step backwards and say, no, we don't want it, because they are afraid of the backlash. And especially among other monasteries and nunneries and, you know, politically. Yeah. So although they would like it on one hand, and they say, well, we'll see how it goes. And if it's all okay, then in the future we will do it. Mm. But they don't have that kind of courage in a way to step forward and say, okay, we're going to be the first ones. And no matter what people say, we're going to do it, you know, because we believe in ourselves. They don't believe in themselves enough. Mm. And so this has also held back the introduction of the Bhikshuni lineage into the Tibetan tradition. Not just the monks and lamas, but the nuns themselves are very, they're very nervous of rocking the boat. They've come a long way in 20 years. They're now very educated, and they're very good in ritual. They're also very good in practice, in meditations. And everybody's, you know, on the sidelines applauding how well the nuns are doing, how well they keep discipline, how nice they look, and so forth. So everybody's you're applauding them, so to speak. And I think they realize that if they take the next step, the last step really for them is higher ordination, that they are going to get caught up in a quagmire of a lot of negative criticism, and they don't feel ready for that yet. Hmm. So this is one of the things holding it back, the whole question of higher ordination. The nuns themselves are very hesitant because they know it won't be to universal approval. So we'll wait.
Yeah.
And that sounds a very sad situation, Bhante.
Yeah, and Venerable, yeah, and I understand that, and I think it's easy from, I guess from my perspective as an Australian, you know, I've grown up as a white Australian man in a prosperous country where I've always had stability, and I've always had the assumption that, you know, there'll be a place and there'll be, like, the law will be on my side and all of those things. And it's very easy to sort of judge people who are not in that situation. But then, their situation is, in fact, a lot more precarious, and that, you know, we have to support and trust people's judgment, you know, ready to support them when they want to take that step. I've heard similar things from, you know, from the women who cook in the kitchens in Thai monasteries, or from Silays or Tilashins in Malaysia, or the same kind of thing. So yeah, I guess we just support people, you know, support women for whatever they feel ready for. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? I sort of feel it's possibly time to wrap up. Although, you know, there's questions for Venerable Chanda online, and there's, let me see. Dear Venerable Chanda, sorry for my ignorance, but would it be possible to live as a bhikkhuni, not an 8-10 preceptor in Burmese or Sri Lankan monastery? She fully understands the situation you're in the UK. Venerable Chanda?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I actually did ordain in Myanmar initially, so as an 8 precept nun, and I stayed there for about 6 years with a very good teacher. And then my health suffered immensely due to the extremely austere conditions and the food. And for me, I was very satisfied actually, because to me, the ordination came from the heart, and it was a full ordination as far as I was concerned. It was a full renunciation. So I gave my whole heart to the holy life at that point. And it was the most significant, probably, ordination that I've done emotionally and spiritually. But when I left Myanmar due to health reasons, I realized that there is no structure for women. There's no recognition of ordained women as part of the Sangha unless we take the full ordination. And when I heard about Ajahn Brahm and the fact that he was supporting the full ordination of women in Australia, my heart just leapt at the idea, because I mean, nobody only partially ordains, you know, you ordain with your whole heart, you give your whole life to that. So of course it was obvious that if that was available, I wanted to take up the full training that the Buddha laid down. So it's such a hard one thing for women to actually enter the Sangha as fully ordained nuns. You know, it took me 18 years altogether from the time I started my meditation practice, 10 years as a laywoman and 8 years as a novice nun, let's say. So after 18 years of getting this wonderful opportunity and, you know, actually being able to live as part of the monastic Sangha, it's not something we want to easily give up. So I don't actually think it would be that much easier to be an 8 precept or a 10 precept nun, because the main rules in the monastic life, the main kind of hallmarks of monastic life are essentially the same. You know, the celibacy and the trying to renounce the use of money. Even as an 8 precept nun, I didn't really use money. Very, very rarely did I have to touch money. And I lived on donations. So that wouldn't actually make much difference. And I think, you know, in order to effect long-term change, we need to start off on the right footing as part of the Sangha with a recognized universal ordination, you know, that enables us to be part of a global Sangha and even dissolves those boundaries between so-called Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana traditions, because we all essentially share the same Vinaya. So I think this has to be the way forward in the end. I mean, I could probably manage on 8 precepts or 10 precepts, but then it wouldn't be changing things in the long run for other women in other generations.
Thank you. Bhante, any comment?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, only just to say that, you know, as a Bhikkhuni, I mean, the question was about going to Sri Lanka or Myanmar, but those two places would be very different. Obviously, in Sri Lanka, there's quite a lot of support for Bhikkhunis today. They're still looking for official recognition and sanction, but there are thousands of Bhikkhunis in Sri Lanka and definitely possible to live there. Whereas Myanmar, yeah, you're probably going to get thrown in jail for being the crime of being a Bhikkhuni there. You could kind of slip by as a Mahayana Bhikkhuni because it's kind of different. So you can probably get away with it. And I think that they do have quite a number of like Taiwanese Bhikkhunis and so on who go there for retreat. But I think as a Theravada Bhikkhuni, it would still be perilous.
Difficult? Perilous. Yeah.
Perilous. I mean, you're really talking about not just where do I sleep, but yeah, I know I have a place to sleep. Yeah, it's in the prison, and yeah, so at least you solve that problem, I guess.
Okay. There's a message here from.
At least Jetsunma appreciates my dark humor, anyway.
Jetsima, do you want to say anything?
No, but what the Venerable Sujato is saying is true. It's actually against the law in Myanmar to ordain as a bhikkhuni. For a Burmese woman, at least, to ordain as a bhikkhuni is against the law, and you will be put in prison.
Yeah, that's
I mean, what the Buddha would have to say about that, I cannot imagine.
Yeah,
and where it comes from, you know, that state of mind.
Yeah,
but it's true, as Sujato says, it's a punishable offence.
And it's not just in theory; it's actually happened. And the tragic story of Ayya Sachawadi, who was deeply traumatized by her experience there. Yeah.
and had to disrobe in court and put on lay clothes.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've got a message from Terence that says, if any Ayah would like to share more talks online. He's saying, thanks to COVID, I'm currently helping TBCM to update and compile a list of monastic Dharma speakers to be shared among TBCM members. And there's a link there. And there's a few links on our chat room that you might like to have a look at. Bhante Sujato, I think perhaps we'll wrap up. Is there anything you'd like to say to sort of final words?
Okay. No, just thanks, Terence, for that. I'm just checking out the TBCM website now. Final words. Yeah, look, so wonderful to see you all here, and thanks so much for honouring me by inviting me along to share some thoughts with you. There is this incomparable gift of the Dhamma, which has been maintained in the world by the Fourfold Assembly for 2,500 years. And we do live in times of climate change. We do live in times of a frightening collapse of democracy in much of the world, of pollution, of so many challenges that are being faced, as well, of course, as opportunities. And we are not being driven into a future by the power of necessity. We are choosing to create a future by our actions. And we have the means by which to create an amazing and incredible future if we so choose. And by we, I mean like humanity. Even though as individuals, then it's very easy to get swept up in it and to feel powerless and to feel very anxious about these things. And, you know, I feel that every day. And so the Dhamma gives us an opportunity to make better choices. And we cannot control what's going to happen in the world, but we can control our own choices. And that the sum total of what happens in the world is what emerges from the sum total of everybody's choices. So having the Dhamma, if having the Dhamma is something which gives us that opportunity for wisdom and for goodness in a way that is just, to my mind, is unparalleled. And so to me, part of what we're doing here is using that Dhamma to step, like I was saying before, to step out in front and to call ourselves and the people around us to be better, to be a higher, to look for something higher, to try to grow, to try to transcend the limitations and faults we've had in the past, and to create something beautiful in the future. So this is my idea, this is my vision for what we can be doing together as a community.